All right. The meeting is, I guess for the record, let's go through what we just went through. So I'd like, is there a motion to formally open the meeting?
I make a motion to open the meeting.
I second it.
All in favor signify by saying aye or raising hands.
Aye.
Any opposed? The motion is carried. The meeting is formally open. And so the first order of business is review and approval of the minutes of the meeting of December 4. If there is anyone has not had a chance to review Brian's draft of the minutes and the edits that Ellen and I made, then we can take this up at the meeting on Friday. We can take it up afterwards, but is there anyone who has not had a chance to review the draft minutes? If not, is there a motion to approve the minutes as edited?
I make a motion to approve the motions as the minutes as posted.
I second.
Any discussion on the edits that I made or Ellen made or Brian's draft?
I'm sorry, and I just muted myself versus unmuting myself. I'm in favor of approving the minutes. I just would make a suggestion here. I just want to offer something. We go through great length to take these minutes and then transcribe what we say over an hour and a half meeting into 4 or 5 pages. I would just offer that. Would it be helpful for us to put that these are a condensed version of the actual minutes, which is the Zoom meeting, which is an accurate representation of what each member of this panel or committee has said or stated? And so I would never want to get to the point where something is lost in translation. It doesn't read that way. And I think it should be noted at the top there.
I think that's a good idea.
My words are as I speak and are captured on the Zoom and not in that. And that is just for ready or quick reference.
Mm-hmm. That's a good idea.
All right. Michael, do you want to make a motion to put a legend to that effect at the head of the minutes?
Yeah, I make that motion, and I would ask that we contain that or put that provision on the top of each of the minutes that this group votes on.
Is there
I
a second?
second the motion.
Is there any discussion on that motion? I think we can take, for lack of a better term, judicial notice of the fact that this that it does the minutes, the Zoom meeting is the best record of the meetings of the committee, but I'm fine with that as well. And apropos of the comment I made in my email to you, I have edited Michael's draft in order to make my own comments clearer rather than quoting myself verbatim. So I think there's a value in letting the public and inquirers know that the Zoom meeting is the best record. So any other questions on that?
No, I think that's a good idea.
Okay, if all in favor say aye or raise hands.
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, that motion is carried, and there'll be a cigarette package warning on the minutes going forward, so that the minutes may reflect that we're all Shakespearean in the way we speak and express ourselves, but the Zoom is the best evidence. So thank you for that, Michael.
Thank you.
Okay, moving on to our solicitation letter. We got some action, and I think our letter is finally on the e-newsletter that went out to the public. And you saw my email following our meeting to the mayor and the board and interested parties, and I tried to express as mild a sense of pique as possible with respect to the responsiveness. So I think we got a little action. Brian, you have now sent us, I apologize for not opening that document. You sent us was it a list of organizations?
Yes, it was.
All right. That
I'm
came
sorry,
earlier.
I'm sorry it was so late. If anyone has any additions or suggestions, because like you know how organizations like they live and they die. So somewhere
The
like
Harbor Heights organization doesn't exist.
all right, thank you.
So I'm looking up the contact information for you so I could get that to you this evening.
Oh, thank you.
Email?
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate it.
And I'll look through it myself, and I think what we can do is what is the sense of the committee insofar as is it an email list or a mailing list or both?
I mean, a lot of the places don't have emails. Like a lot of the homeowners associations, for example, don't have emails listed anywhere that I could find anyway.
So how many are on the list?
I have to go back. Like,
Approximately.
25, 30.
yeah, it's a mix of what Mrs. Roberts sent me and just my own research.
Okay. And they are, for the most part, street addresses and not email addresses?
Mostly, yeah.
All right.
So
So,
Dan, plowing through before we officially got started, and I've been able to find email addresses for the first at least 6. So I'll keep going.
okay, why don't we do this? Since we're meeting again on Friday, why don't we review the list and send to Brian our best information regarding the continued existence of the organizations, any updated addresses we have, email and whatever. And then we can, I think we'll probably be able to resolve to have you, Brian, send the letter out to the organizations via email. And we'll ask Sally to arrange to have the street address only sent out by village mail. And if failing that, I agree to donate to the village of Mamaroneck the costs of postage for the remaining addresses. And I'm very happy to stuff the envelopes myself.
I'm gonna volunteer, but okay.
We'll split it up.
Okay, that's fair.
So okay, that'll be a big step forward. And I actually had in mind finding some way to generate some publicity about this, and getting an article perhaps in the Journal News. And the more I started to think about it, the more I thought I would be encouraging a journalist to also bring in the controversy involving the dispute between the ethics board and the board of trustees and the Goldstein case. And I thought that that's not a good idea, particularly after reading the annual report that Mark Ettinger submitted to the board of trustees, which is a fairly strong document.
Yeah.
So
Dan?
yes.
All right, you go ahead. I'm sorry to interrupt.
I was just going to say that I mentally tabled it.
I think, as much as we want to publicize it, I think that with Brian's list there and everything else, I think we've made a very good faith effort, extreme due diligence to identify all of the constituents here. And I agree with your assessment with the media. I think that might be counterproductive. And so I think that we've done enough now at this point, and we should send these letters out in the email. And I think that we would have approached as many people in the village as could be reasonably expected.
I would also say, if I remember correctly, Jerry, I think it was Jerry, maybe it was Augie, came back and said that they will get to the village mailing lists this week. So that would be further outreach on top of what Brian's put together.
Yeah, that would be a big step forward if we can get that out to the village mailing list.
I'm sorry,
And-
Mr. Hofstadter emailed us saying he didn't get a link to the meeting.
Yeah, I responded to, I didn't copy everyone,
Oh,
saying look around 10:55.
thank you.
And I also really would like to see if someone would authorize a mailing to village employees as well. It's such an important constituent group. They are right at the heart of the impact of the code of ethics, and they ought to know directly that we exist, and particularly regarding any concerns about intimidation or a desire for anonymity, they ought to at least know that they have this channel to us. So village mailing list, great. I'd like to see if we can get a mailing to employees as well. But I guess it's progress. And we have not heard anything further regarding the extension of our work past December 31. We are not going to be able to complete our work in 3 weeks. So I will continue to ask the board for some guidance on getting our calendar extended.
Dan, I think one of the emails back from either Nora or Kelly said that the request for an extension was reasonable.
Yeah, I did see that, but they both
And I
said that.
think Victor chimed in agreeing, but I'm not sure what that all means.
Yeah.
Other than they agree that December 31st is off the table.
I did see that, and that's nice to read, but I think given that we were created by a formal act of the board with I believe a due date etched in stone, that we need them to vote to extend our term.
Okay,
So
I agree. I make a motion that we send a letter to that effect to the board, and that, and I mean to interrupt you, Dan, I think you're right? This was etched in stone by their vote, and I think that they should know and they should acknowledge that we're going to take longer. And I think we should include in that letter the importance, as you state, of communicating or making the employees, the village workforce, aware of this process so that they have an understanding. And at this point, I mean, we need to put that out now, this week, next week, at the latest. So I would make a motion. We just advise the board of those two matters.
is there a second to that motion?
I second.
Any discussion on the motion?
I mean, I just should say that I'm against extending the deadline just because I thought like the Board of Trustees really dropped the ball in getting this committee going. And it's already December, unbelievably. Like, I'm against extending the deadline. I've always been against it, but I'll vote in favor of the motion because like the committee's work is obviously not done.
Any other discussion on the motion? All in favor, please signify by saying aye or raising hands.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, that motion has been passed. Thank you for that. All right, let's move on to where we left off. And if it's okay with you, I would like to start with there were 9 points that called for substantive adjustment or changes based on our discussion. And if we can go through them and let me know if I have accurately recorded the sense of our discussion. First, the first one is not something we discussed, but I came across it in my review, and that's number one in my email to you. Under the officer, board member, or employee, and I questioned why there are two phrases, one decision-making board and the other board with a capital B. Any understanding? Anybody have any idea whether there is a distinction between those two terms?
Unless, the only thing I could think of is if the term board was used generically so that it would cover an advisory committee. That's the only thought I had.
I don't think decision-making board is anywhere. Oops, you guys went away. I don't think decision-making board is defined anywhere. Not. So we need, I think that's one where we want the term to be inclusive, but maybe we point out to the Board of Trustees that it is ambiguous, and we ask them to be more precise when the code is finally revised. I can also, as I did before, ask the ethics board and ask the village council what the intent of that was. I did hear back from Mark Ettinger on my last inquiry. I did not hear back from the village attorney. So I think maybe the best thing to do is just point out that, call it an ambiguity, and tell them that it needs to be addressed. Okay, moving on to number 2, customer and client. I've indicated where the terms appear in the code, and we had a discussion on it last time, and I felt that it was important to leave this definition in. Any discussions on how I've defined it, or to stay the way it is as I've defined it? Is that another section that should be referred for someone else's consideration? Okay, move on again. Number 3, I have added the term dependent to the list of covered parties, or I mean in relatives. And I did that because I picked it up when looking at one of the model codes, and I thought it belongs in there. It's somebody could be living in the house who is financially supported by, no, your son, I think.
No, I was a dependent last year. I don't know if I'm a dependent this year. I gotta ask my parents. I'll ask them when I get home.
Do you pay rent, Brian?
No, I don't. That's what
Well, there you go.
That's what I love about living with them. Free rent.
Well, we have our older son back here working from home, and he doesn't pay rent, but I can tell you, it's the return of in-house tech support. And that is really, really important for my age group.
You're bartering.
Exactly. Exactly. Just a quick aside, I'm doing a presentation tomorrow to a university class, and I lost my PowerPoint and he found it for me buried in the hard drive, and he saved my life.
Oh, that's
So, all right, so dependent is in there now. I'm just going to go through this. Just shout if there's anything, anybody has any comment or question or objection. Number 4, immediate family members. I left this in order to cover it under relatives. And for the reason I gave. Relatives, I replaced the current definition and adapted one in the model code. So,
sorry, I just had a question regarding the dependent. Is it, like with any of these terms, is it used anywhere other than in the definition section? Because if it's not going to be used anywhere else in the definition section, then it's like,
I'm sorry, what was that question?
sorry, is the word dependent used anywhere other in the document other than in the definitions? Because if you're going to define something and it's not going to appear anywhere else in the document.
I think I do have it elsewhere. Hold on a moment.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's in 3 other places.
All right, thank you.
And I lost you. Somehow I lost you guys on video. Oh, you're back.
All right.
Okay, village officer, this is one we spent some time on. And I've deleted the separate, we agreed that the current entry and definition conflicts with the definition of officer, board member, or employee. So I deleted village officer, and it's back in it's now in officer, board member, of employee, and employee. So it's included in that section there.
I thought we had agreed, I'm kind of making a left turn, at our last meeting, that when we came up with the definition of, the broad definition of who for the code of ethics, that we were gonna also then come up with a term, a shortened term, that would be all inclusive to use throughout the document, so as we get into various pieces of the code, we don't have to list, 9 million, an elected official, a board member, committee member, blah, 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 blah.
I do remember that. I think I struggled with it a bit, Ellen, in the application through the entire text. And so I focused on the real ambiguity between what was a village officer and the rest, and I kind of left the triple-headed officer, board member, and employee in. If that is a problem if you can point to where that is an issue or where it causes a problem in other parts of the code.
No, I'm not saying, I don't have an issue with this definition. I was just trying to make it less wordy further on in the document.
Yeah.
Where we're saying, repeating all these groups. As we go through the rest of the code, I'll point out, because
Okay.
we'll come across it.
Okay. Next, the verb controversy, and I think Michael was Michael's comment regarding shall is actually, I believe he said we should use shall when I had substituted will, and the model code uses shall. uniformly in the context in which it seeks to prohibit.
You know, Dan, I actually thought about that since we last spoke. Look, the words, any wording that we use or any language or however we structure this, I think it's got to be very specific and compel. And if at the beginning of this, we establish shall, will, must, are all synonymous, I'm okay with that, right? I just don't want to see and or any language that leaves it up to the discretion of the individual. If we want something to be in there, it should be specifically stated.
I think that the view you expressed actually is the one that is in the model code.
Okay.
So I think where we wind up on it is, again, we're not going to tear this apart word by word, but I think when we file our report, we will say, use this verb for the prohibitory and compulsory context, and use may when using the permissive context, because the model code does, and let them decide whether they want to take our suggestion or not. Let me just skip to 9 for a minute. We'll go back to 8. I think we agreed that we would take out that section in 24E4, which seemed to impose some sort of an HR solution on a nepotism problem. So I just struck it.
It was just that one sentence, though.
Correct. That's all I
Right.
struck.
Yep.
So let's go back to 8, because my recollection was not the clearest about your proposal, Ellen, regarding recusal, whether we agreed on it, and if so, where we would put it.
So I did look at the model code, and that is not in there if someone's running for office. I don't know if John has joined us yet, but he felt very strongly that that should not be included. And as I mentioned, I took that right from Harrison's code, so I have no problem if we strike it.
Okay. Any other view on that? All right, we'll delete it. All right, let's move on to section 21(4)(k)(2). Oops, I lost. Sorry, let me get that back. Yikes. Hold on, sorry, folks. Hang on one second.
Do you need your son? Sorry.
Touche.
You beat me to it.
While he's looking, 21(1)(4), did he say?
I think 21KF1.
Oh, 21K. Something right when he gets
Yeah,
to
I
it.
think present and future employment, I think. Yeah.
Okay, got it.
I think I got it back. There we go.
All right.
Sorry, I am having issues. All right, 21(4). There. JK. There we are. post-employment lobbying. Is that,
I need the number again because I'm on present and future employment.
Yeah. That's it.
yeah. Well, there it is. 20 proposed to that's what we're talking. No village employee, board member, etc. Yeah, the wording of that, which I highlighted, where special advantages by virtue of current or prior contact and relationship with the village may be realized, is to me void for vagueness. Special advantages are not defined anywhere, and clearly it allows any number of interpretations. I think we understand what the intent is, but the language doesn't get there.
Maybe we can use some of the language from up above, like pecuniary interest, financial benefit. Because like I agree, the special advantages isn't defined anywhere.
Hey, can I ask, why wouldn't we just remove that sentence in its entirety and put period there? And then it's a complete ban from engaging in activity, which I think is generally the direction that was probably wanted to go with this. If I could offer the other side of that too, where somebody might go and say, I want to appear on behalf of my neighbor or whatever. But I think if you remove that sentence and it just puts a complete ban, it takes care of the problem.
Or I think, as Ryan suggested, we could simply put where the individual has an interest as defined elsewhere.
Can I ask why it's so restrictive for 2 years after the service ends or employment ends? That's a really long time.
Well, these matters, I think, hang on for a while.
So, but maybe we can say, so it's to cover lingering things that started while they were in their seat, as opposed to keep them from appearing. I just think that 2 years is, I can think of so many reasons why. I mean, when your employment ends, it usually ends for a village employee, maybe not for a board member. I could see, I don't know. Do we agree on the 2 years? I'm not hung up on it. It just seems like such a long period of time to me.
If I remember correctly, that's also in the model code.
Yeah, I was going to say 2 years does not seem like a long time to me.
Okay. All right.
But
Well,
here's a case where the who is different from the who that we've defined at the very beginning of the doc. So do we intentionally want to limit this population?
No, I wouldn't think so.
So
Although, does consultant appear in the original definition? Well, consultant is added here, I believe. Can I suggest this, that someone conform this to the model code and look at maybe one of the other applicable codes that we have to see where we stand and propose language that reasonably approaches or conforms to the other codes? Is that how's that?
Oh. I'll take a look.
Okay. Okay. Let's go on to 21.4 NR. And obviously, if there are sections here that come in between or at any point which you wish to discuss that I have not put in the agenda or otherwise highlighted, please make mention of that. We'll obviously discuss that as well. All right, 4N.
I'm sorry, why are there 2 commas after village in N? Sorry, I'm like OCD, so I notice these things.
Well, there aren't now.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the end, we'll give it that scrub.
Oh yeah, and then there's 2 periods after interest.
Yep, I was just gonna say that.
I offer to be a good proofreader at the very end, if that helps.
Thank you.
You're hired.
Printer's daughter.
Uh-huh. Okay.
I do the same thing, Jocelyn. My dad was a printer, my mother was public relations, so this is in my blood.
We have so much in common, Ellen. When this is all over and we can go have coffee, we're going.
Yep, okay.
Yes. Sorry, guys. You can come too.
Yeah, I'll join you.
Oh, whenever we get through this and COVID is over, you're all coming over to my home. We're all gonna get together and
And do everything ethical.
we'll meet one another in person and we'll have brunch or dinner or something here. Okay.
Brian, are you putting that in the minutes so we can hold Dan to it? What?
You want me to?
No, I'm kidding.
I think he's just
Yeah,
invited.
It's on the Zoom.
Actually invited the public.
There you go, Mike.
You realize you've invited the public, the entire public.
Okay. Any issues on any questions on this one? I mean, I must have flagged it for a reason. I'm trying to remember. All right, let's go to R.
Can I just stop there before we get to R? Can you go back
Yeah.
up
Yes.
to O, to inducement? And I don't know if this appears anywhere else or if I'm not seeing it, but is there any provision that mandates one of these people to report unethical behavior?
You mean an affirmative duty to report?
Yeah. And we put all of this in here to say you can't engage in this, but we have all of these other people who also have a responsibility to the village that, and I'm not saying this should be, but should we consider that they have to report this, right? If they become aware, to whatever degree of unethical behavior or illegal behavior, do they have a responsibility to report it?
Sounds familiar.
Mike, I think I understand what you're saying, but legally, I don't think you can force anyone in coming forward. And none of that was in any of the other municipalities' codes.
Okay, I just asked that. I know that certain employment obligations are that if people become aware of certain types of misconduct, that they have a responsibility to report it. And so I don't know if the same thing here. I mean, this in effect is law that the board would adopt and compel.
I know the training I always had, both at JP Morgan and at NatWest. The training classes said that all staff had that responsibility.
But does our code say that? And that is the question. I mean,
but I was just going to say the written code, when I read the code of ethics, it didn't really state that, but that was part of the training that we were given.
I would just offer that it might be a potential gap, and that, I'm not saying we have to solve it tonight, but that we just look at it from that perspective, that there could be people who, by virtue of their employment responsibilities or their board responsibilities, may become aware of certain situations that could be in violation, that they might have a responsibility to, I don't want to say report, but to force some sunlight on, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, I headed the Inspector General offices for City of New York in early 1980s, and there was, I believe, I call an affirmative duty on the part of city employees to report violations of law. I don't believe it was ever tested legally, and there have been over the years discussions as to whether corporate lawyers had a duty as lawyers to report misconduct. It was known as a noisy withdrawal. And I don't believe that ever was enacted into law. But let's see if there are any codes that call for that and if it's in the model code. There's somebody who can take that on?
I can look for that.
Okay, thank you.
Dan, can you go into the document and show the changes that are made? So if you go to track changes, under review, go to review. And for simple markup, show that, that drop down. Click on the arrow and do all markup so we could see what's been changed. Yeah,
Yeah, I should have done
thank you.
that. All right, now I know. Okay, thank you for that.
You're welcome. The red lines on the side showed that something was changed, but we couldn't see the changes.
Indeed. Yeah, and my own changes were not in there. And that's now reflects what I changed in N.
Yep.
All right. And are we done with N?
Yeah.
It's a duty to disclose. And R, based on our earlier discussions about no informal opinions and all opinions have to be formal, I inserted the reference to an advisory opinion as opposed to seek the assistance of the Board of Ethics.
Should that, after advisory opinion, you have the word of, should that be from? I could be just as anal as Brian.
Can be, and now it is.
Oh, thank you.
Okay. Moving on.
Can I just go back to that for 1 second?
Yes.
And I'm sorry if I'm not familiar with the process, but that's seeking of opinion. In theory, we've talked about all of the opinions being cataloged, for lack of a better term, right? That somebody should be able to research that. Should they seek that opinion on their own and then say, well, this was my interpretation? Or should there be some mechanism that they're seeking it by contacting the board, and the board either referring them to that or saying, yes, your interpretation of opinion 2018-4 is correct? What do we mean? Should they seek it on their own and say, this was my interpretation? Or should they seek it by personal contact?
Well, I think that's where we're saying get the advisory opinion from the Board of Ethics means you're contacting them. That's the way
Okay.
I read it.
I did not see it like that. I mean, if these documents are going to be cataloged for public opinion, and I go to the Board of Ethics, lack of a better term, website or their folders, and I look at it and I say, well, I looked at this, and like I say, this opinion applied to me. I sort of does it hurt to have them specifically send that in and say, this is my interpretation of your previous opinion regarding this circumstance. Do you agree or not? If for nothing else, to benefit the person seeking the opinion, that it's concrete at that point.
I confess I don't, you could start over again, Mike, because I'm not sure I quite understand what your point.
Should somebody seeking an opinion seek it on their own by just looking and reading previous opinions and saying that applies to the person? Or should they be required to make personal contact with the board and say, my interpretation of your previous opinion is this? Am I correct or not? Because not every one of these opinions is going to be spot on for every topic. And there's going to be a little bit of gray room. And I think that the only person that should give that final opinion should be the board, even if they've made a previous opinion. They say, yes, your circumstances in a situation here are so similar and so close, although not identical, it's consistent. Or no, we need to look at this closer.
So is your point that the language as written should seek an advisory opinion may be interpreted by someone who says, oh, I'll just check the glossary or the index of opinions and interpret it, as opposed to seeking an actual formal opinion?
Yeah, they can do their research and look at it first and then forward it or discuss it with the board. But I don't think that determination should be left to the individual based on a past opinion issued by the board. And as we go forward, and all of these are cataloged, right? That may happen.
But unless it's the exact situation, right? And that's why we're doing this, for consistency. But the likelihood of it being the exact situation, right, is nil. It's small. So I like that we should be clear that they can't make their own. To my point, they shouldn't be making their own decisions based on this catalog of advisory opinions if their circumstances are not equivalent. And that kind of would address that. Otherwise, you need to get your own advisory opinion to add to the catalog if your circumstances differ. Something like that is what you're saying, Mike?
Yeah, I just think that the final interpretation should come from the board, and we can just spell out what you said there in the final sentence. You know what I mean? We want people to look, right? I think the intent here is to have these opinions cataloged so that people can look at them and review them. But what we don't want is somebody making an interpretation themselves based on their situation and then referring back to a previous opinion, right? I mean, they can look at it, they can seek whatever guidance they want from that, but they need to go to the board specifically.
I think we cure it by making clear in the language that they have to go to the Board of Ethics and get an opinion regarding their own situation. So if that's the intent, let me work on that language so that it is clear. Okay, thank you. Let's go to 21.5A on distribution. Ellen, I will turn it over to you for this.
Sorry, I had a question about the.
Yes, go ahead.
Sorry. Like if we're saying, oh, you have to seek an advisor, I'm just playing devil's advocate, but if you're saying you have to seek an advisory opinion from the ethics board and you can't rely on these other advisory opinions, and what's the point of publishing those other advisory opinions? Then what are they being used for is my question. But I see your point and I agree. I think someone should be encouraged to
document. I think so that there's a log of for consistency in the future, it should be used. That's the benefit, is my opinion. That's how you ensure consistency on the go forward. for this, that there to me is a very clear, good reason to log these advisory opinions. I think if not, we should rediscuss that, but that was where I thought we landed.
Yeah, no, I definitely think they should be logged. I'm just like wondering if someone can't rely on that, or if they're being encouraged to seek an advisory opinion, then like, I don't know, I just feel like there's a mismatch.
Brian, I think the key phrase here is when in doubt.
Yeah, I agree.
If someone is not in doubt and they've consulted advisory opinion or opinions that are publicly available, they say, well, I'm not in doubt, I'm going to go ahead. But if they are in doubt, then they should not interpret an opinion. They should go to the board and get something that's formal.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Maybe that's on that's somewhere on the when logging an advisory opinion or when viewing these advisory opinions, please keep in mind. It's a,
I like that. I think that's a great suggestion.
How would you phrase that, Mike?
Like that this is just for review and to assist you in ensuring ethical behavior, something along that.
Mm.
But that for the only affirmative defense you have is when you make a referral to the Board of Ethics regarding your specific circumstances. And I'm just thinking that out loud. I don't know if that sounds correct, but I like that first thing. Put it on the top there.
I can work with that. So let me work with that, and I'll come back and see if we can make it clear that you can't bind the ethics board or the village by citing an advisory opinion. That is not a defense.
Well, wait, Dan, what if their circumstances are exactly the same though? Then wouldn't that be, or are we just saying these advisory opinions are just a log and regardless, you need to go to the board? I think we have to decide which we're saying. If their circumstances are exactly the same, do you still feel the same way about what you just said?
Well, there you go. Exactly the same. This is how lawyers make their money. On distinguishing cases and showing ambiguities. So I think if the facts are four square, almost identical, and an employee says the facts are the same and I'm relying upon them, then it's a matter of interpretation.
I don't want to put more work on the board, and I know we're already down 2 people, but I think the goal is to have more interpretations rather than less, right? And so that there's less likelihood of unethical behavior. So I think it's best if it's something that appears identical, the board or a member of the board could say yes, or the member, I don't want to say the member, but a board very quickly could say, yes, this is identical. We reviewed it. It takes no further action other than documenting Mr. Kofi's request for an advisory opinion. It was consistent with previous opinion in 2017. The matter is closed.
Right, and when somebody reaches out to the board after doing research in the log and they feel something's identical or close to identical, they could be then saying, I took a look at ABC and I believe this is the same case. And we're at that point, they're just asking the Board of Ethics to confirm the understanding.
Fair. Okay, as I said, let me work with that, come back to you with something and see if that reaches our understanding of it. All right, we're coming in on the hour mark, so we'll go, I think, a few minutes more. I think we're doing fine.
I'm here now, and I apologize for not being on earlier, but I got a link to a trustees meeting as opposed to our meeting. But pardon?
How did that meeting go?
It went right to executive session. So
Did you get the link for that? I'm just kidding.
But I don't know where you got to regarding, documenting the request for opinions. And one thing that kind of stuck out in Mark Ettinger's email that he sent to us was, I think what they originally said to us when they met with us was that it seemed like a lot of their work was advisory opinions, but then when he gave a survey of what they had done over the last number of years, very little of it was in fact advisory opinions. So I just think that all the requests, regardless of how they come in, should be made in writing and cataloged.
Yeah, I think we're not.
Yeah, we're in agreement on that.
Yeah, I think
Okay.
we're with you on that, John.
Good. Okay. Because I just think that alleviates a lot of potential problems.
Yeah, I think we're with you on that, and I will make it clearer, attempt to make it clearer in this section.
No, I was late joining, so I don't know what you discussed previously, so I apologize. But in relation to how this was being discussed, I wasn't sure if that was part of how everybody felt.
It is.
So John, I'm
Go
sorry,
ahead.
Dan, go ahead.
Go ahead.
John, one of the things you'll be happy to hear that you did miss is I looked at the model code of ethics and there was nothing about the section I had included that you disagreed with. On if you're running for office, you need to remove yourself from the boards, various boards. So we've agreed to strike that.
Okay, I think that's good, just because I think sometimes those boards are feeding grounds for people who are interested in running.
And I said John would be happy to hear that if he were here. So I was relaying that news to you.
Thank you.
All right, and John, we are anti-informal opinion and pro-formal opinion. So
Okay, good.
Okay, let's tackle one or two more items, and then we'll adjourn. I think that we're really doing quite well here, and who knows, maybe we will finish by December 31st, but I don't think so.
Yeah.
Let's go over to 21.5A. Ellen, do you want to pick that up? I think that's your section.
Yeah, sure. Really, the only changes that I made here, other than including committee member. So here's a case where the definition of the who for the code of ethics is spelled out twice in this one blurb. Whereas if we had a single term, it would just shorten the words, but that's fine. So the first thing I did was add committee member, but I also then added that the code of ethics should be distributed to all of the who annually. Because someone's hired, 20 years ago, they're not going to necessarily remember. And if we're saying this is important, you need to issue it every year and get acknowledgement annually that people have read it and will conform to it. The next thing I added here was something we mentioned, I believe, at the last meeting, that the code of ethics statute has to be posted in all public buildings. And that's per the state. And you can get the poster from the state. So I've added that as well.
Okay, 21.5B.
What I've added there is, which also was from the state, that needs to be maintained as a public record and that the disclosure has to be made to his or her immediate supervisor. And stressing that the disclosure does not cure a prohibited interest. It just means you're disclosing it. And that theme continues through my next couple of changes.
Bruce C.
But under C, where I've also added, in the event of a change in information contained in the annual disclosure, an amendment must be signed and filed within 30 days, indicating the changes. That was from Scarsdale.
Okay.
And presumably that change, that revised disclosure would have to go to your immediate supervisor or,
Correct, which I think
Or-
was said in the blur. Can you scroll
Okay.
back to that, Dan? Yes. No, he scrolled too far. Yes,
okay.
yep,
So what,
and also
how,
maintain as a public record, yep.
and how is that handled for elected officials or committee or board members?
In terms of supervisor,
Yeah, I mean, I just,
I
I-
would have, okay, so I'm on the budget committee. And we answer to the Board of Trustees, so to me, they would be my immediate supervisor,
okay,
but me being me, I would also include Jerry as the village manager.
Okay. I
So
mean,
maybe
that's,
not-
I think that too. I mean, on a different note, the budget committee is an advisory committee. Where, so there's really not decision-making power for anything.
right,
So-
and I don't have to fill out a disclosure, but,
Right,
yeah,
I don't, I'm talking, I meant more so for a land use board or something like that.
then I would say that would be the Board of Trustees and the village manager. Should we
Yeah.
spell that out?
I don't know, that's, what does everybody else think?
Should be clear. No one
I
should.
can also include that when I do my racy matrix.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I'm just not following that completely. So this change would only be limited to the Board of Trustees and the land use boards?
Well, a transactional disclosure is only, like if I was on the board of trustees and I was a real estate agent and we were going to change the zoning law for, that would benefit a client of mine that was selling their property, I would have to disclose that I have a client that would, that is in the middle of we're in the middle of a transaction and they would potentially benefit from this. I was actively representing them and this would increase the value of their property.
Yeah, I'm okay with the change. I don't know how far afield do we go with this? That's my question. I just don't know what groups are we going to make file this amended.
I would think it would be any, it would be any employee and village officer board, I mean, I think it's spelled out up there, but the reality is somebody on the budget committee who doesn't have decision-making ability, they're not in a position, they could be reviewing, I don't know, something, and it could have a financial impact on them in some way, but not, they don't have the ability to pass a law or change regulations. So
We don't have the ability to do anything, John.
I've been there.
Sorry.
I've been on that budget. I've been on the budget committee. I know. It's unfortunate,
Yep. No, we're making some headway.
but my point being that there's really a limited number of, committees that would actually impact. Land use committees and the board of trustees, really.
So Ellen, do you have a takeaway on this? Are we requiring any adjustment of these sections?
I'm not, I mean, to me, that's more of a process. But it's easy enough to add in a sentence. Because I think, John, if I'm understanding you correctly, you really want it spelled out that if you're not, I wouldn't put it this way.
I think we don't want to dissuade volunteers from serving on the budget committee. You know what I mean?
Right, but we don't get annual disclosure, so we're not part of that list. So I think once we have that list of the who, then we could
The cover-
say,
Right.
right, then we could call out in these sections, if you're an appointed board, like the land use, you would file the disclosure with the Board of Trustees, or, then we could do
I-
that kind of grid, but
Yeah,
until
I
we had
think-
that final list, we don't know.
Yep, I think a covered person kind of thing, getting a list of who's a covered person would be
Yep.
fine.
Okay. All right, so my takeaway is making sure that covered person, you and I, Ellen, can exchange emails on this,
Okay.
on the who, on covered person.
Actually, I had sent last week, I think it might even have been in the email when I sent in my edits here. I could dig it up again. I had done a comparison between the who for disclosures that we have versus the other 6 municipalities.
Yeah, that's in your original RACI.
No, not in the RACI, was, I think, attached to the email where I put in the changes to the code. I could find it, it's easy enough.
Okay,
And some of the other villages had who's that we did not, that I thought may have made sense.
okay. All right, anything further on this? Let's just, under 5G, I will just point out to you that I made the substitutions which were recommended or agreed to at our meeting. So I've eliminated the phrase vacator and substituted suspended. So I think it conforms to what we intended. And this might be a good point to stop. We're at almost the hour 15 mark, and we can pick this up again on Friday. We've covered a lot of ground. Unless is there any other issue that anyone feels we must discuss at the moment now? If not, thank you all so much again for meeting at midweek for this extra meeting. And is there a motion to adjourn?
I make a motion to adjourn.
There's a second.
A second.
All in favor? Aye.
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 Raise hands. Opposed? We are adjourned. Thank you very much. We'll reconvene and see one another again on Friday at 12 p.m. Thank you.
Okay,
Thanks.
great.